Radio Tatooine.
Live in Berlin.
Am 12. April 2022 im Columbia Theater. Alle Infos unter www.radiotatooine.de.
Hey, willkommen zum Buchclub. Ich bin Tim und mir digital gegenüber sitzt der berühmte Pläne-Schmied und das kriminelle Mastermind Baron Grifthoff, okay, auch bekannt unter seinem Decknamen Christoph, der einmal mehr eine ziemlich verwegene Idee hatte. Und dank dieser würden wir uns kurz an vereinzelte internationale Hörer wenden, ausnahmsweise, und sagen, if you're here for a certain interview, just skip ahead 4 or 5 minutes. We will put a timestamp in the show notes. Also, we would like to apologize for any accents or grammatical misfires or just bad miscalculations you're about to hear. We tried our best. Ja, so ist das. Christoph, mit wem sprechen wir heute und warum ist das sehr cool?
Wir sprechen heute mit John Jackson Miller, dem Autor unter anderem von Kenobi, von The New Dawn, von Knight Errant, von den KOTOR Comics und von noch viel, viel mehr. Und wir können an diesem Punkt schon sagen, wir haben das Interview schon gemacht. Wir wissen also, dass es cool ist. Wir glauben es nicht nur. Und insofern ist es mega toll und wir sind alle gehypt hier.
Und ich glaube, hätten wir die Aufnahme nicht schon auf unserem Rechner, könnten wir nicht glauben, dass es wirklich passiert ist.
Genau, dann wäre es einfach nur eine wilde Illusion und wir würden vermuten, dass wir irgendwelchen Tagträumen erlegen sind. Ja.
Wichtig dabei zu wissen, das Interview hat Spoiler für Kenobi und für die KOTOR Comics. Andere Werke tangieren wir nur so am Rande.
Bei Knight Errant ein bisschen was vielleicht noch, aber nur ganz an der Rande vielleicht. Ansonsten, glaube ich, müssten wir relativ clean sein. Ne?
KOTOR hat sein 10-jähriges Jubiläum, glaube ich, schon hinter sich. Und Kenobi fast. Das heißt, wir gehen davon aus, dass die Werke zu den bekannteren im EU gehören in ihren jeweiligen Medien und wollten dann schon über einige der größeren Twists und einfach größeren Entscheidungen sprechen dürfen. Gerade wenn man halt schon mal ihren Autor hier hat.
Eben, genau.
Ja. Eine normale Buchbesprechung, die auch eingangs spoilerfrei ist für Kenobi, haben Sissy und ich damals aufgenommen für Folge 2 des Buchclubs. Also ich glaube 7 Jahre oder so fast her. Der Crate-Drache in der Exilliteratur hieß die Folge, denn am Anfang habe ich noch
das war die erste noch im Keller, oder?
Erste Kellerfolge, ja.
Mega.
Und in Folge 1 des Buchclubs, noch davor, blubbere ich mehr oder weniger allein über A New Dawn. Ebenfalls ein Buch von John Jackson Miller. Also das praktisch die ersten beiden Buchclub-Folgen über Bücher von ihm waren und dass jetzt er der erste Buchclub-Interview-Gast ist, es schließt einen Kreis, von dem ich nie gehofft hätte, dass es überhaupt ein Kreis sein könnte. Also wirklich, ja, irre. Und ihr werdet diesen Gedanken von, das hier ist irre, werdet ihr in jedem unserer Sätze hören, zwischen den Zeilen. Das ist immer ich kann nicht glauben, dass ich das gerade frage, aber, ja. Also, irgendwelche letzten Worte vorweg oder springen wir einfach rein?
Ich würde sagen, wir entschuldigen uns an dieser Stelle wirklich für sämtliche Fehler, die wir gemacht haben, für sämtliche Fehler in der Darstellung unseres Landes, unserer Sprache, unserer Kultur, die wir gemacht haben in diesem Interview. Ansonsten hoffen wir einfach, ihr habt mega Spaß dabei gehabt. Wir hatten ihn definitiv.
In diesem Sinne, wir sehen uns auf der anderen Seite. We are joined today by the creator of Kenobi, A New Dawn, the KOTOR comic books, The World of Knight Errant, and the chronicler of the Lost Tribe of the Sith, Though that is assuming that all of these things haven't been created previously by a certain very stable Sith Lord who might have invented all of reality as a Force vision to test himself. Still, for the sake of this interview, let's pretend all of us actually exist. John Jackson Miller, thank you very much for being with us today.
Thank you, and yes, I thank the Sith Lord Daemon for creating all of us so that we could actually have this conversation. That's the character from Knight Errant that you're referring to there.
Oh yeah, we should add that. He got a lot of work done early on in the universe. Yeah,
that was a fun character. He was clearly an idiot, but it was a fun character.
Had a lot of self-confidence. Yeah. So we want to talk about a couple of your works today. Maybe starting with Kenobi, okay, because it's going to get a Essential Legends Collection re-release in the very near future. And one thing that is particularly notable about the Kenobi novel, particularly when compared to other tie-in novels, is that it had quite a long gestation period, so to say. So as far as we understand, it was conceived quite early as a graphic novel, and then several years passed until it became what it is today. So looking back at that process, was that sometimes frustrating because it was spanning so much time?
Yes.
Or did it benefit the novel because you had time to think about it and time to... Yeah.
It was something where, when I was first writing the concept, it was the fall of 2006. The Knights of the Old Republic series was in its first year. I was in my last year at the publishing company I worked at, desperately looking for a way to get out and no longer have to work there anymore, because I realized that company would not be there in 20 years, and indeed it's not there now. And I was taking whatever steps I could to try to create some more projects. Folks at Dark Horse said, we're looking at doing a series of graphic novels for the what would have then been the 20th anniversary of Dark Horse, which would have been, the 30th anniversary of Star Wars in 2007 as well. And, Jeremy Barlow and I discussed a variety of things. And at some point we got talking about Western movies, and I said, wait, I've got it here. Here's my notion for the Ben Kenobi Western. And it was an email that I sent, about 4 paragraphs, that more or less has the broad strokes of the novel. And he wrote back, now we're talking, literally. And I wrote a version of the plot, and he sent some revisions, and then I did a second one, and he sent some revisions, and I did a third one. By the time the third one rolled around, I had quit the day job. I had a number of other things on my plate. We were beginning to do Vector at Knights of the Old Republic. That was the crossover with all the other titles. I was beginning to do other side projects like the Knights of the Old Republic handbook that we did. And, also what particularly came along to really put a stop to Kenobi. When we're in the Los Angeles event, the Star Wars Celebration in May of 2007, there were rumors that ABC, an American television network which is owned by Disney, which did not yet own Star Wars, there were rumors that ABC might be doing a TV series set in what they call the Dark Times, which follows episode 3. And so up until that point, we had been very careful about using Obi-Wan in this period, but we didn't think that there would be anything we would collide with. Well, 2007 in particular, if they had done a show back then, that would have, trodden upon us very likely, because Ewan McGregor was still, the same age as he was at the end of the prequel trilogy. And so, that was one reason we thought maybe it needed to be shelved. The other reason was that Jeremy had moved on to be the editor in charge of the Indiana Jones property. And I had long said, if Indiana Jones 4 comes along, I'm leaping on that if I can. And and so he hired me to write the novelization, or the graphic novelization, for Indiana Jones and the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull. And we ended up putting Kenobi on the shelf because it was now too late to be part of any anniversary. And also by that point, the novel graphic novel outline had gotten to something like 50 pages, which is way, way too much for comics. And I said, this is only really going to work as, a novel. So, we put it on the shelf. Yeah, it turns out that Indiana Jones was not followed up by, what I had expected, which would have been more, comic series. I do start writing prose, though, with the Lost Tribe of the Sith series that you mentioned, which leads into the Knight Errant novel and the character Lord Damon. And so by the time we get to 2012, I have really finished up all my work at Dark Horse because I'd done something like 100 Star Wars issues there, and it was just time for other people at that point. And so I was looking for the next project. And this also coincided with a period where Lucasfilm was going to go back to basics, more or less, with the characters. They wanted to focus less on, the random, different parts of the timeline and more on the core characters. It was in this phase that you got announced. There was a Luke novel, a Leia novel, and a Han novel that all came out in this period, or it actually straddles into the Disney period. And, so Obi-Wan Kenobi, when I proposed that, basically I'd said, here, I have this idea on the shelf. My editors at Del Rey said, yeah, let's go forward with this. And I went back to the plot and found out that, it really didn't need that much revision. There are some characters that changed somewhat, some characters that, got merged or altered in some way, shape, or form. But otherwise, a lot of the scenes that I had written to be in the graphic novel are there in the book.
Is there with Star Wars comics, is there always kind of a certain obligation to have a big action set piece every issue? And then when you move to a novel, does that free up some? Well,
what we were talking about was what we call a done-in-one or an original graphic novel, which means to say that it would have been a 200-page or 120-page or whatever book. Mm-hmm. So I would not have had the tempo that I needed to worry about an action scene, an action scene, an action scene. And, that ended up, again, benefiting the novel. In fact, when I originally submitted the manuscript of the novel, we don't see Obi-Wan until page 60. He doesn't actually appear until later. And they said, that may be a bit too much. Why don't you add a prologue where he appears? And I said, well, I have this prologue that I was planning on doing that would have, I didn't have the offer to write it yet, but I knew there would be an offer to write a short story for a Star Wars Insider. So what I did was I said, well, let me just plug that in. And I wrote that in, I think, a day and a half. Mm-hmm. The opening sequence where Obi-Wan brings Luke to the bar, the cantina. And so, oh yeah. And when I did end up writing a short story for Insider, I had to set it even before that. So it's a prequel to the prequel. Which follows the prequels. So so that is what happened. And so, yeah. And the novel, is announced in October of 2012, just as I'm really starting to write it. Mm-hmm. That's always frightening. And by the beginning of 2013, it was finished. The revisions came along through the spring of 13, and then it was actually released I believe the last week of August in 2013. I went home to my hometown in Memphis, Tennessee, to do the book launch at the local bookstore there with a lot of my friends from high school. That was kind of fun. But yes, that was a hardcover release. That was also my first audiobook. So that was Jonathan Davis did the reading for that. What they're doing now with these books is that the American publishing business really has moved on from the very small paperback, mass market paperback is what they call it, the really small disposable paperback size, exactly, and have moved on to the size that Lost Tribe of the Sith always was, which is the trade paperback. It is more durable. It costs twice as much, but that makes it more attractive for booksellers to stock. So what they have done is they have created this Essential Legends collection whereby all of the books that they're reprinting or bringing back from Legends, instead of just continuing to keep using the old version and reprinting it. I think Kenobi itself was on its 17th printing or 18th, something like that. Instead of continuing to do that, they put new covers on them and went from there. And so, yeah, it's something where that new version of the book is coming out in April. There is a second reprinting of it that is coming out in hardcover from a bookseller called Barnes and Noble. This is in September, and this is a bind up. It puts Kenobi together with the Obi-Wan and Qui-Gon novel that Alan Dean Foster wrote about 20 years ago, and the name of it escapes me. But
The Approaching Storm, right?
I think that's
The Approaching Storm? Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's it. And so it's one of those things very few people are going to know about unless they go to that one store. I've been telling people, if you want to make sure you get these things, pre-order them, because these are specialty items. I certainly like to have one of everything. I regret to say I do not have a German copy of Kenobi. I have them from many other countries.
I'm not sure if we have a German copy of Kenobi.
Yeah, I don't know there is one.
I was just wondering, because there is a twist early in a chapter that's kind of based around not knowing the gender of a certain character.
That's correct.
That would be difficult to do in German.
I'm certain it will, and I've already gone through this with the Russians because again my background was as a Soviet studies student, and when the Russian publisher, their translators, they contacted me for help with certain translations and things. And again, you have gendered verbs and things like that, or gendered nouns and things like that to deal with. And I said, I had to be so careful when I wrote that book because again, and this is something which the gender reveal on the character Ayark. This was not something in the comic book plot. It was something that came along. It was really inspired by Jen Heddle, who is the Lucasfilm fiction editor. She had suggested gender changing a couple of the characters because, again, it had been a Western and, it was mostly male characters. This resulted in the change in Ayark's character, and then also the character of Oren Galt. He had originally had 3 sons. That became a son and a daughter. So anyway, that was a change that I made, and I think that it really adds something to the book. And we brought that Ayark character back when I did a short story for the Star Wars for a Certain Point of View book in 2017, which was an actual anniversary book, and it's just 10 years later than the one I was supposed to write.
So I'm curious about the Tusken Raiders and how you played with them. When you first introduced them in the book, they are basically very much like the animals that Anakin slaughters in episode 2, and then they become very humanized, and then in the end they slaughter Jawas, which is probably not the nicest thing of them to do. So I was wondering, how human did they ever feel to you, or how alien did they stay?
I was never supposed to say whether they were human or alien, and I don't think we did. We may have humanized them in some cases, particularly when Annalene sees that the child of Ayark is killed. What I wanted to do with them was I wanted to sort of evade the trope of this is the native culture, which is actually very noble but misunderstood. I kind of wanted to say that there's bad on both sides here. The Tuskens are not nice people. They're not. There is a lot about their culture, their society that is antithetical to having neighbors, is antithetical to being some people you want to hang around. But I wanted to try to get Obi-Wan to at least understand some of what they were going through. And what they were coping with. If they seem, somewhat nicer at all during the book, that is in part a symbol of the weakness that has been left in their tribe by what happened with Anakin. They're shell-shocked. They're shell-shocked through this book. And, that Jawa scene you mentioned at the end, that's very much intended to signify that they've gotten their spirit back. And they're willing to go out and do horrible things again. So yeah, I know that particularly they've been playing with some of these things in some of the newer TV series as well. I was not the first person to write the Tuscans. That was Tim Truman in the Outlander comics storyline that was in Star Wars, I guess Republic, I think it was. So I'm coming along in the middle of this, and I'm able to play with certain parts of these characters and their society. Hopefully, people found it a good take.
Definitely. I'm kind of curious, this kind of follow-up, do you see a future for them where they actually have a real future? Because kind of in the book, they are losing their past, aren't they? They are losing their legends, they are losing their traditions, and now they have to move forward somewhere.
Well, everything is a collision. I mean, history doesn't stop. Whatever people imagined for themselves, ends up butting up against what somebody else has imagined. One way or another, Tatooine is going to change in a way that, it will either benefit them or not benefit them.
And speaking of change on Tatooine, do you think that, like in Dune, it might rain there in the end? Because, I mean,
there are sometimes clouds.
There shouldn't even be life there. It's in a binary system. There shouldn't even be life there. But again, this is a difference between me writing Star Wars and writing Star Trek, which I do a lot of. In Star Trek, I would be able to get into the various dangers of living on a planet that has the gravity lens effect going on that happens when you get your two suns in alignment. Very much have various seismic and other ramifications that would come along. And I can talk about that in Star Trek, but you can't get anywhere near it in Star Wars. In Star Wars, you get full moons during the day. I mean, that's you can't. It doesn't really.
So because of the weird gravity, imagine binary sunset, but Luke is kind of slanted to the right.
The thing is, I do sort of wink at the science in one of the first lines of the book, and in fact, it was the first line of the book until we added the prologue, because I think Ayark's first line was something like "Everything casts two shadows," and that would be the case on Tatooine. Everything would cast two shadows, depending on where the suns were relative to one another. But yeah, again, you can't really. Star Wars is not a franchise where I can dig deep into the hows and whys.
Yeah, we haven't talked about Obi-Wan in particular so far. So one of the interesting things here is that he's obviously coming right off the tragedy of Episode 3. So he's had what many people would consider just a really rough week, nothing worked out. And in writing the book, how did you find a balance between kind of hinting at the tragedy that had just happened, but still not turning this into a painful read? Because it could have easily been that if it had all been Obi-Wan. Yeah.
Well, one of the things that happens in a crisis, and over the last years of various crises in the world, people have had to figure this out on their own, is people have to get good at compartmentalizing. That there are these larger issues, these bigger existential things going on, but at the same time, everyone is still, got to eat dinner. Everybody's still got to find shelter. Everybody's still got to pick up their kids at school, or if not school, then what? And so everybody is always balancing the mundane personal things that are important to them specifically with the bigger issues that are important to everyone in the whole galaxy. And, I think that Obi-Wan is able in the first weeks of this to immerse himself in his new environment in the Tatooine culture, but also to sort of deal with the the logistical issues of how do I not starve? Where is my water coming from? How am I going to get a front door? The very first chapter that I wrote of the book, when I actually wrote it, because they wanted to see a sample chapter, is the chapter where Annalene drives out to him to deliver the groceries that he forgot to take with him. And she sees him struggling with his animals and struggling with, his plants, his garden. And, she's able to say sort of, okay, here's how this stuff works. And again, it's, there's something, I guess, metaphorical in there of there are other things he can't do anything about, but here's this thing that he can do.
So at the end of the novel, what's kind of the lesson that Obi-Wan takes from that? Because he is fighting a dragon at the end, so he does kind of show himself as a Jedi, but also accepting that he probably won't be able to do this anymore.
Yeah, I think he comes to understand that, and again, that was the other thing that we added at the very end of the process was the crate fight. It wasn't actually in there to begin with. The publisher suggested let's put an action scene in there to give people one with a lightsaber, but otherwise, originally my plan was, he was never going to brandish the lightsaber any place where we would see it. And they said, well, people have been waiting for 350 pages. Maybe we should give it to them. And I'm like, okay, that's not an issue as long as he puts it away afterward. I feel that, the whole idea of the book is this is him basically removing the cape, removing Obi-Wan and becoming Ben. And, I've said with regard to any later stories, any future stories, anything anybody else would do, my thinking when I wrote the book was entirely, I'm going to write about a guy who is never going to leave here. I'm writing about a guy who has to come to terms with the fact that the next time he leaves this planet, at least as we were looking at things in 2006 when I was writing this, very likely that it would be the case that the next time he leaves his planet, it's with Luke Skywalker to go fight the Empire, and he's getting ready for that, and he's getting ready for that, and I think that the Obi-Wan that we deliver by the end of the book is at peace with that idea that he is either going to die here or he's never going to see, if he sees the rest of the universe again, it will only be for the final battle, the big thing, the Death Star. And that's what ends up happening.
Now, what I found interesting about your take on Obi-Wan is you kind of bring together different types of Jedi artifacts. Like he's a Western character. He's basically trying to be the man with no name. He's also a dragon slayer. He's also basically the samurai. And you brought all of them together. And what I found incredibly impressive was at the end when you have this Western shootout, which then turns into a medieval fight, which then turns into a meditation. It's brilliantly constructed. I don't have a question about that. I just thought it was brilliant.
Well, that was George Lucas.
Thought you should know. Yeah,
that was George Lucas first. I mean, that was he's got things from the Hidden Fortress and Seven Samurai in there, and of course Seven Samurai gets reinterpreted as the Magnificent Seven as a Western, and so all of these things are going through these things. I mean, one of the humorous elements here I've always found is that the novel it was a novel and then it was a movie that is probably most like this book is a Western movie and novel called Shane. That is the place where the mysterious stranger who rides into town initially came from in Western fiction, more or less. I mean, there have been other stories like that, but that was the main one. And of course, Shane in the movies is played by an actor named Alan Ladd Sr. Alan Ladd Jr., his son, was the producer of Star Wars. So it all sort of comes around.
Right. I think we should talk a little about Oren Gold. At least we should, I think, talk about his end because it's gruesome.
Yeah.
I think my real question here is what the hell, man? This is.
I relish writing the endings of my books. I usually write the final chapter of characters' arcs a little before I get to them, particularly on my Star Trek novels. I need to know where I'm going before I actually get people there. But usually by that point, 80%, 90% of the way into the book, it has revealed itself to me what people deserve. What would be the worst thing I could do to this person, or what would be the best thing I could do for this person? Where should they wind up?
You're writing about characters to find out their weakness. And
Yeah.
once you know it, you strike.
Yeah, and this was somebody who was a slick talker. This was somebody whose entire, everything was built on him being, able to convince other people of things. He was a salesman. He was somebody who we have that moment where Annalene sees him riling up the mob, and she comes to the conclusion that, this is somebody who, if he got loose, if he got out there into society as a populist tool of the emperor or something like that, he could do many, many worse things. And the idea always with this book was, even though this was a small story, not a galaxy-shaking one, that the stakes would feel big and feel real to the people who were in it, and there would be winks every so often to, you can visualize Oren Galt making a name for himself with the Emperor by turning in Obi-Wan. He has to be robbed of his ability to talk. He has to be, and it has to be done in such a way that Obi-Wan's hands are relatively clean, because it would not be the Jedi way to silence him. And in fact, Obi-Wan lets him go. He just keeps saying, don't do this, turn back now, turn back now, turn back now, because he's foreseen that this will end really, really badly.
Yeah. And I must say, it was a bit of a horror scene, that ending scene. And I really congratulate you on that one, but it was really, really good.
Well, it was one of those things where I had written the piece where they had stolen a vaporator, and it's like, well, what are they supposed to do with this? And I said, okay, yeah, that's a way to go. And the symbolism there as well. I mean, they put him on the funeral beard so that he could actually reach it. Anyway, it's one of those moments where it works really well.
Yeah. So we've already mentioned you've also written a lot of comics for Star Wars.
That's right.
And we were wondering, when you compare comics or graphic novels and traditional novels, and look at what can be kind of captured from the cinematic Star Wars in each medium.
Yeah.
Where do you see different strengths or weaknesses or challenges? So it's really difficult to pull off in a novel, but can be done in a comic.
One of the problems with comics forever, and I'm also a comics historian. I worked in comics journalism for many years, and I still run a website called Comicron, which has the sales figures for all the American comics going back for decades. Mm-hmm. The thing with American comics is we've tended to have difficulty with displaying motion of vehicles. There have been, for example, lots of war comics, lots of auto racing comics. Problem with auto racing comics is they pretty much all look like a parking lot, because with a Western, you can kind of go with the musculature of the horse and imply motion and dust flying and everything. But a lot of the war comics in particular, unless something's on fire or is firing something, you don't really get the sense that it's in motion or it's in action or anything. And one of the challenges that I always had was trying to depict, with regard to space battles or activities in space, what was where, what's doing what, how are things moving relative to each other in 3 dimensions? And again, a lot of that is just a difficulty in me communicating with the artist, But often I have to actually. I did a book here recently for the 40th anniversary of Battlestar Galactica, and Battlestar Galactica is nothing if not an air combat series. It's more or less, what is the Battlestar but an aircraft carrier? What are the Vipers except airplanes? I have one of the Vipers back here, and showing these engagements, as you would see in Star Wars with X-wings or in other media with whatever fighters there are. I found that I needed to provide the artist with sketches of what was where, and what I expected to see in terms of the things colliding with each other. And one of the things that I found with novels is that it's much easier for me in prose to really, because I'm doing all the description, to really get in there. And, some of the engagements in my Star Trek novels, I have a situation in the Star Trek Prey trilogy I did, which is kind of like the Battle of the Five Armies, because we've got Klingons, we've got the renegade Klingons, we've got the Federation, we've got the Romulans, we've got the Breen. Everybody's here, and they're all at different cross purposes and doing different things. And I'm having to say, okay, here's where they are relative to each other. Here's who's on fire at the moment. Here's what's going on. And they tend to be these big set pieces. And I can say without doubt that they are a lot more successful in prose than they are in comics, or at least have been in my case. There are people who are just very, very good at it. Dustin Weaver, the artist on Knights of the Old Republic, did some of the wonderful designs for ships and armadas and things like that. That's some of the most beautiful work that's in that book, which is now one giant book, the big Knights of the Old Republic series now. It is difficult when you get into kinetic things going on. There's a reason that people prefer to show lightsaber battles as opposed to fights with TIE fighters and other things. It's just not that easy in two dimensions on the comics page to depict.
Knights of the Old Republic kind of moved back and forth between various artists along its run.
That's right.
Are there any considerations, if you already know this coming story arc will be very comedy based, or this will have a lot of space battles, do you then pick a specific artist for it?
Well, that's one of the things that sort of goes wrong sometimes is
okay.
The second year of the series, the plan had been we were going to alternate between three. That was the Days Nights year, where it was Days of Fear, Nights of Anger, Days of Hate, Nights of Suffering, and the idea was going to be we were going to alternate between Brian Ching and Dustin Weaver. And, Brian is, they're both good at everything, but Brian, likes doing the fights and the lightsaber battles and the characters. And, Dustin, you give him anything big and mechanical and he does great with it. And almost right away, the scheduling got messed up, so that Dustin ended up writing the arc that was intended for, or drawing the arc that was intended for Brian. Brian did 2 issues of one arc and, is not there. We had Harv Tolibau there for a while, who's now doing the comics for Star Wars Adventures. We had Bogdazo, I think, was in there in that stretch someplace. Yeah, just about every time I've tried to schedule my designs and my concepts, something goes wrong. And it's not just Dark Horse. Very early in Iron Man, I was given the chance to write what would have been the cover artist Adi Grainov. It would have been his very first issue where he drew the interiors. He's the person that drew the wonderful covers for us on Iron Man. And in fact, he was later hired because of those covers for the movies to design armor suits for the movies. But he's, very much 3D modeling kind of a guy. And so I wrote a comic book where basically it's entirely in a featureless spaceship where, Iron Man and Titanium Man are beating each other up. So it was ideal for somebody who's doing 3D modeling to design. And he ended up not being able to either draw the issue or the cover. So I think he might have drawn the cover. I can't remember, but he ended up not getting to draw the issue. So I'd love to be able to do that, but you just can't always predict.
It's just Zane Carrick's luck.
Yeah, very much.
Influencing everything around him. Yeah.
It's just comics. It's that way. It's that way everywhere. It's every publisher, everything.
So with Knights of the Old Republic being this giant series of having, I think, 50 issues in the core series.
Yeah.
What's interesting is if you read it now, like a lot of the key players from later on and from the entire run already are introduced and kind of seem fully formed in like the first issue.
That's right.
So it seems like there was either a lot of planning involved or a lot of luck, or maybe both.
In some cases, you're planting the seeds. I did not know the stories of all of the Covenant Jedi. I did not know even what they look like in the beginning. I, gave them to Brian to create the designs for, and I would see this character looking a certain way or that character looking a certain way, and I'd be, okay, this is how this person is going to be. And so in some cases, I'm actually building on what has been presented to me on the page and elaborating on it. Sometimes we did go back and plant things, though. I mean, by the time the 6th issue of Knights of the Old Republic has that cameo appearance by Roland, the Mandalorian, well, the first issue had already been drawn of the next story arc by Dustin Weaver. So we knew what Roland looked like. And I said, put Roland in this scene, put Malik in this scene. Didn't put Demigol in there because we had a reveal coming up, but yeah, that was, and in fact, Demigol hadn't been drawn yet by then, so because he was in the next issue. One of the nice things about as these things go on for a while is a lot of the stuff, people don't know now how long it took these stories to come out. People don't know now that there were all of these gyrations going on. They'll look at, why do they have so many different artists, not realizing that, these were magazines coming out monthly, not understanding that, these things were not released as one graphic novel. I mean, 90% of all graphic novels are actually just collections of serialized stories. Many of the novels that people think are novels, from Charles Dickens to Sherlock Holmes, that these were all serialized. The Foundation trilogy, these are stories that appeared over years and years. The fact that these things hang together when they're in one cover, that's very good. And the fact that I was able to kind of write the whole series myself, and that is incredibly rare. That meant that, I was able to mine from all sorts of moments in the books and, do little things, some of them more than little. The perp walk where Zane is, being, that's what they call it in the United States. When the person who has been arrested is being walked out of the courthouse to the waiting vehicle, or to the courthouse from the waiting vehicle. We have that scene in Knights of the Old Republic 6. We ended up doing that identical scene with Demigol, or who we thought was Demigol, in issue 47. There are several things like that. Zane running into the temple to see his fellow students dead. We did that, I think, 3 times. So we were always doing callbacks, always doing echoes. And, if anybody were to say, were you planning this in issue 40 by then? No, we didn't know that there would be an issue 40.
It would have been almost crazy to expect that this would run. Yeah. Like, you couldn't be sure it would run forever.
And that's why I had to be careful with things like Demigol, where I wrote it to run both ways. If the series had been canceled before I could reveal, the Demigol Roland thing, then I was perfectly ready to, just have it end there, and it would just be a bunch of scenes with Roland where he's sort of out of character. But instead, we got to actually pull the trigger on that, and I'm really happy about that.
Yeah. I think so are we. I think this was really one of the best things in comic books that I've ever seen. But I have another question, because you said you planted certain seeds. There were quite a few seeds that misled fans quite considerably. I think we expected to find Darth Sion in there somewhere, or Darth Nihilus and Kreia. Yeah. I think this was a conscious choice, wasn't it?
I had not played the second game. I also knew that the number of people who had played the first game was much, much higher than the number of people who had played the second game. And the second game was also many years down the road from where we were, because it was several years even ahead of Coder.
Yeah.
So I was reluctant to wallow too deeply into it, but that was the game that was just now out. And, I figured, well, the whole purpose of my storyline is to put the reader into the shoes of the Covenant masters, because, they're basically seeing something bad happening to the Order the same way that the Jedi in the prequels were seeing something bad is going to happen to the Order. The difference was that in watching the prequels, the viewer already knows the thing that's going to happen. The viewer is in the position of the Jedi. The viewer already knows Darth Vader. The viewer already knows these things. I wanted to have the readers in the position of the Covenant Masters, where you think you might know what's going to happen. You do know some things about Revan, but you don't know everything. And you don't particularly know exactly who's who. And, if there's a wild card in there, and the wild card, there's really two. It's Griff and his ability to just upset anything he's anywhere near. And then Zane's luck. And Zane's success at staying alive, and their misinterpretation of Zane repeatedly. If they had at any point understood this kid, maybe this thing doesn't happen. But they're shell shocked. They're fatigued from what has happened earlier in the Tales of the Jedi comics and in the Sith Wars, and so they're set up to fail. And I let them fail.
I'm actually curious about the Tales of the Jedi comics that had this totally different design, totally different world.
Yeah.
And of course, the KOTOR games looked quite different.
Yes.
And the comic books looked much closer to the KOTOR games. Was there an intention to bridge that gap more?
I understood the reason why they had decided for the video game that it was going to look like Star Wars. Right. It was just, if the whole idea that Star Wars is this lived-in universe, and they have reached a technological apex, and it doesn't get any better. They may build bigger Death Stars or whatever over the centuries, but they're never going to invent anything any faster than hyperdrive. They're never going to invent anything else like that. So I figured that basically what would just change maybe would be a matter of styles, couture, dress, attire. So I figured, well, there's sort of this movement maybe 30 years ago before the war where everything is much fancier and everything like that. And it lives on in some elements of the series, particularly, for example, in the robes that Lucian wears, which have this gilt all over them and everything. And it really kind of, evokes all of that. But, one of the things that we definitely wanted to do was get away from, the idea. One of the things that was happening at this point is Lucasfilm was saying, okay, let's not add any more Jedi powers. Let's not add anything else. And also what you have in sort of that early work, including by Tom Veitch, who was just passed away, sadly, you have sort of this mythological version of early Star Wars where people are using extreme powers, extreme Jedi powers. Planets are moving around and things like that. Godlike almost. And we weren't going to go there. And so I was trying to sort of bring some of these things a little closer to Earth when I got to them. But my one story that is actually set in those times in the comics, that's that flashback with Hazen. You still have some of that aesthetic there. You still have some of that look, where it's all very fancy, and there are elements from ancient history on Earth in it.
You mentioned the Rogue Moon prophecy.
Yes.
That the Masters had, and then obviously that leads to a lot of death and suffering. And we've also mentioned that for Zane, things tend to kind of balance out. Like the force kind of seems to flow or act both ways. So what's your general take on the force? Is it because typically in your stories, problems aren't solved by overwhelming force powers. They are solved by people coming up with very clever, very complicated schemes on the fly.
These people are the superheroes of their own particular universe, and they have these powers. But my thinking was always, I was never that interested in the characters that used it for brute force or to make themselves, seem supremely powerful or anything like that. I was always interested in characters that had sort of foibles. And, where I did really play with it was on the Sith side, a lot during Knight Errant, where the Sith are trying to figure out what it means to be Sith. And I would look at various things that had happened before and say, well, how could you actually use this? How could you, use it? The twins that are in the novel, Quillen and Dromica, who have the entire society under thrall, basically them mind controlling other Sith who are mind controlling the population. That's just a basic science fiction story. That's a basic science fantasy story that could have been in a Star Trek or something like that. But then I found a way for it to work using how the Force worked. One thing I never wanted to get into is anything in terms of quantifying how the Force worked or anything getting into the origins. I know they did that later on with in Rebels and various other things, but that wasn't my job. I take the universe as it's presented to me.
You've mentioned other franchises, and obviously you've written for Star Trek, you've written for Battlestar, you've mentioned. Yeah. I think you've also written for Halo at some point.
Halo, Mass Effect, another video game series yet to be announced. That's just something that over the years, usually when you're working with one licensor, they also have another license. Or other licenses, and so it's easy to go from one to the next. It's interesting to watch how the handling of the universe or handling of a shared universe is done from franchise to franchise. It's interesting to see how it differs. It's been interesting to see how they've influenced each other. I have written 2 essays for a friend of mine, Dr. Amy Sturgis, writes books about and teaches about various pop cultural franchises. And I've written a pair of articles for her for a duology of books that they're doing on, there's one on Star Wars and one on Star Trek. And what I've written about is basically the evolution of canon and what it means for the tie-in books and things that are connected to it, and how they have pulled ideas from each other, how they've learned lessons from one or the other, or decided to go in a completely different direction, or copied it, or whatever. Those books are coming out, I think, later in 2022. But it was really interesting because I was writing both of those pieces more or less at the same time, or researching them, and a lot of it was just stuff I knew from my own experiences. But it really did interest me that, okay, this first moment here, we have Gene Roddenberry getting involved, getting really, really upset with the first, young adult book for Star Trek that comes out in 1968 because it's just horrible. And him deciding to take an active role in fixing it is one of the watershed moments where suddenly these books never mattered. The fact that they didn't reflect what was in them, because that same publisher was publishing novels for I Love Lucy and the Beverly Hillbillies and every other license under the sun, and there was no pretense that it mattered what was in these books, and there certainly was no pretense that what was in those books would ever make it back to the screen. But you have this beginning in Star Trek. As I say, at the time, Roddenberry said we should hire D.C. Fontana, who was one of the writers on Trek, to be Leland Chee, basically, to be the keeper of the holocron. And it did not happen at Paramount at the time, but it shows that they needed that even back then. somebody to wrangle all of these licensors. And then you see the moments where things start feeding back between the media, things start feeding back between each other. I mean, the much of what we know about the Enterprise in Star Trek came from a fan who did the blueprints. He did the blueprints for the Enterprise. Franz got a license to do the Enterprise blueprints. I think I actually have them right over here. And those blueprints, elements from them appear in Star Trek The Motion Picture. It's one of those things where things start feeding back from things. And, the first names of Sulu and Uhura come from the books. And then this happens as well in Star Wars. Things start feeding back. And then we get, what happened in 2014 with the New Dawn and Disney and the Story Group. And, you see this evolution that's going on. And, you've continued to have people, making decisions, reacting to things in these things. Star Trek right now, navigating the streaming series, the novels that I've been writing. I've been working with Kirsten Beyer, who is one of the people in the story room for these Trek series, and she's the co-creator of the Picard series. I mean, to be able, with my most recent novel, Rogue Elements, to be able to actually talk with her and say, okay, here, I'm establishing this character's background and officially here. What are we going to do? Yeah, that's wonderful. And people are now they're writing me every so often. Sometimes my mentions will explode or something on Facebook because one of my characters from Iron Man turns up in an episode of What If or something like that on TV, and it's just sort of amusing to see out on this end that things that we did 5, 10, 20 things people did 50 years ago or having a life someplace else. That's kind of amazing.
Have you been surprised by Ray Sloan, which you've created, I believe, for A New Dawn, and then she became like a central character?
Ray was planned. Ray wasn't planned when I created her, but when I created her, I said, okay, this character is representative of a certain sort of Imperial, and I said this character needs to have a future, or could have a future. I talked to the folks at Lucasfilm while that book was being written, and I said, if you're looking for somebody to carry forth into the later books and the later projects, well, she's both a good character and one of the few survivors of A New Dawn. So I think even then I knew I was going to be killing a lot of people. So that's one of my problems is I've had a lot of books with body counts. The Picard novel that I just wrote, I made a point of, I think there's exactly one death in the whole book. Because I said, in the middle of what we've been through, let's not do this.
Mm-hmm. That's a great choice, actually. That's a very positive choice. Yeah. So looking forward to more deaths you might plan in the future. Is there anything you have in store for Star Wars coming up? Maybe something we can look forward to?
Well, I have those books that we've mentioned coming out. Literally nothing that I'm working on right now has been announced for any franchise. So it's a weird period where sometimes I'll have something that has been announced that I can talk about. I think this is the first time I've actually mentioned those 2 nonfiction books. So there you have that. But yeah, there are more announcements coming. But as for which franchise, I cannot say, or which franchises, I cannot say. But it is plural. But I'm always in conversation with folks at most of the franchises in terms of keeping my passport stamped.
Well, we're certainly looking forward to reading a lot more from you. It was absolutely fantastic to have you with us today.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
And that's probably, and at this point, probably would say something very impressive for the show.
You're witnessing one of the famous Radio Tatooine outros, which are always kind of just hanging there.
Oh, well, there you go. Well, let me give you one here. You can cut to this.
Okay, perfect.
People, for anything new, people can find me on my website, farawaypress.com, where I have behind the scenes notes on all of my books, or at least all the ones that I've had time to write the notes for. I have a Twitter feed, JJM Faraway, and then I am on Facebook and Instagram, John Jackson Miller.
Excellent.
Thanks for being here.
All right. Well, thanks for having me.
Ja, krass. Ich glaube, das war der erste Satz, den ich nach der Aufnahme gesagt habe und auch der zweite nochmal.
Ja.
Und auch was mir weiterhin durch den Kopf geht.
Wir haben uns dann beide noch etwas erstaunt, begeistert und so weiter angestarrt, waren auf einem absoluten Adrenalinhoch. Also alles richtig gemacht.
Wir hatten überlegt, ob wir danach noch mehrere Bungee-Jumps machen.
Ja.
Noch einen Fallschirmsprung.
Und wir waren sogar fast in der Stimmung, einfach direkt noch einen NJO-Podcast aufzunehmen dazu, weil wir uns dachten, ach, jetzt sind wir eh schon mal hier, jetzt sind wir in guter Stimmung.
Lass jetzt die komplette NJO machen. Genau. Ja, wie ihr merkt, der tatsächliche informationshaltige Teil des Podcasts ist jetzt eigentlich vorbei. Das heißt nur noch so als persönliche Schlussnote. So, gerade wenn man jetzt als Star Wars-Fan geworden ist, viel über eben Bücher und Comics, dann sind diese Namen auf den Büchern ja einfach diese fast überlebensgroße Sache. So, du hast keine Bilder meistens vor Augen zu den Autoren, aber du hast sie im Regal stehen, du siehst den Namen, du läufst dran vorbei.
Und man hantiert damit ja auch irgendwie als Fans Familienmitglieder. Ja. Das muss man ja auch sagen. Es ist ja eine unglaubliche, man hat ja das Gefühl, man kennt die Leute eigentlich in- und auswendig, obwohl man noch nie mit ihnen gesprochen hat. Das sorgt dann immer auch dafür, dass man, wenn man sie dann mal trifft, so glaubt, man kann jetzt eigentlich schon unglaublich detailliert mit ihnen sprechen. Und es kann dann immer zu gewissen Brüchen kommen dabei, aber gut.
Und gerade bei Star Wars merkt man ja auch, wie wenn das Franchise von einer Hand in die nächste geht, wie sich immer wieder so das Genre leicht verändert, wie einige Autoren sagen, ich versuche so das Durchschnitt-Star Wars so nah wie möglich zu matchen und andere sagen, ja, ich bieg's ein bisschen mehr in das, was mich persönlich interessiert. Und da denke ich, hat John Jackson Miller immer eine coole Balance gefunden zwischen beiden. So diese Geschichten sind schon klar er, so der Humor ist immer er, die ausgeflippten Pläne sind immer er, aber es ist trotzdem sehr bedacht darauf, gut ins Universum zu passen.
Richtig.
Oh ja, ich wollte noch speziell das erste KOTOR Trade Paperback loben. Das gehörte, glaube ich, zu den ersten Star Wars Comics, die ich hatte. Ich glaube, vorher waren es immer mal so einzelne Hefte, über die man gestolpert ist. Und einerseits hat es natürlich davon profitiert, dass ich die Spiele toll fand, aber ich würde auch im Rückblick sagen, als ich es jetzt für das Interview alles nochmal gelesen habe, einfach die Idee und die pure Gerissenheit dahinter, das gesamte erste Heft über so wacky Comedy-Hijinks zu bringen und dann zu enden mit eigentlich einem der größten Oh-Shit-Momente in Star Wars. Das ist für mich wirklich bis heute die Messlatte eigentlich, an der ich alle ersten Comic-Hefte, alle ersten Kapitel von Büchern, an der ich das alles messen würde, als einfach, was ist das Optimum, was theoretisch ginge.
Ja.
Also, falls wir es mit einer Spoilerwarnung kurz bringen dürften, du denkst, du bekommst die Geschichte von einem tollpatschigen Jungen, der Jedi werden will, und irgendwo ja, aber dann öffnet er eine Tür und seine Lehrer haben gerade den Rest seiner Padawan-Klasse umgebracht. Und er wäre der Nächste gewesen, wäre er pünktlich da gewesen.
Ja.
Und das heißt, von einem Panel auf das andere weißt du plötzlich, was das für eine Reihe ist und wovon dann die nächsten 30 Hefte handeln. Also einfach ein cooles Bild. Und es ist eine Idee, und das habe ich mich nicht getraut, eben im Interview anzusprechen, weil ich nicht wusste, wie er reagiert und auch nicht weiß, wie du reagierst. Weil es ist eine Idee, die theoretisch ihren Weg ins Kino gefunden hat mit Episode 8. Es ist eigentlich ein bisschen Last Jedi, wo Luke eine Vision kriegt und dann überlegt, bringt er einen Padawan um. Du hast sogar Luke Lucian so ein bisschen.
Wobei ich sagen würde, dass man es den Leuten, nachdem man sie kennengelernt hat, in den Comics, auch in den ganzen Flashbacks der Comics, da versteht man, warum sie so reagieren und warum Luke so reagiert hat, verstehe ich bis heute nicht.
Es ist andersrum erzählt, ne?
Ja.
Genau. Und diese Charaktere wurden klar gebaut für den Twist.
Genau.
Sie waren von Anfang an als etwas zwielichtere Jedi ausgelegt. Genau. Es ist einfach nur witzig zu sehen.
Und sie haben danach, das muss man auch sagen, sie haben danach ja noch ihren Haupt-Arc. Also wenn ich jetzt an Lucian denke, der hat ja danach wirklich einen Arc, wo er sich nochmal wandelt, wo er das Ganze nochmal reflektiert. Und das ist unglaublich cool geschrieben. Und wir hatten im Vorgespräch vor dem Interview schon gesagt, das erinnert uns ein bisschen an Jaime Lannister halt. Oder an den Jaime Lannister Arc, eine Weile, der da war, bevor er dann nicht mehr da war. Aber wo jemand wirklich, der halt wirklich auch Böses getan hat, dann nochmal reflektiert, okay, vielleicht bin ich ja doch ein anderer. Und der dann nochmal wirklich diese ganzen Wandlungen unternimmt. Und ob er dann Darth Sign ist oder nicht, ist dann egal. Er ist es nicht, wie wir wissen, aber trotzdem, also vor ihm liegt eben noch was. Und bei Luke endet es dann halt irgendwie damit, dass er auf einer Insel sitzt und frustriert ist und naja.
Ja, Lucian wird nochmal wieder vor Varianten der Entscheidungen gestellt eigentlich fast, ne? Er trifft ja Zane wieder und wieder.
Genau.
Und dann, das hatte ich jetzt auch beim Reread gesehen und das ist noch deutlich trivialer, aber es gibt einen Moment, wo entweder ein Mandalorianer oder zumindest ein Charakter in Mandalorianer Rüstung, ich habe es mir nicht mehr notiert, entschließt sich gegen irgendwas oder sagt, das ist keine gute Idee und er sagt es mit den Worten, this is not the way.
Und das ist natürlich cool, okay.
Ich muss den Screenshot nochmal raussuchen, aber ja, also absoluter Zufall, aber coole Kiste. Ja, hast du noch irgendeinen speziellen...
Also ich habe, glaube ich, in der Vergangenheit schon an einigen Punkten, mindestens in den Kommentaren auf weltenfunk.de, aber vermutlich sogar schon in irgendwelchen Folgen einfach gesagt, wie sehr ich Knight Errant liebe. Und witzigerweise, nachdem das Interview vorbei war, hatten wir noch kurz irgendwie, weil ich 5 Minuten noch mit John Jackson Miller gesprochen und da konnte ich ihm das nochmal sozusagen offenbaren, wie toll ich das finde. Und das war für mich persönlich dann eine große Freude, das getan zu haben. Ja. Ich finde, der Knight Errant Roman, den möchte ich auch in dieser Stelle nochmal wirklich empfehlen. Vielleicht ist da auch was für Leute, die jetzt mit High Republic sowieso jetzt eher in der alten Republik ein bisschen unterwegs sind. Es ist eine komplett andere Sache als High Republic auf der Basis von dem, was ich über die High Republic weiß, was zugegebenermaßen nicht so viel ist. Es ist eine unglaublich coole Welt, also es ist quasi so ein bisschen die Vorstellung wie eine Odyssee ist es eigentlich. Du hast halt wirklich eine Galaxis, die abgeschnitten ist, wo Leute auf quasi einzelnen Inseln wohnen und wo niemand so recht weiß, was da draußen los ist, wer kontrolliert jetzt irgendwo was. Und die Republik hat sich quasi in sich selbst zurückgezogen, was witzigerweise recht cool sogar nochmal referenziert wird in Kenobi, auch von John Jackson Miller natürlich, dass es eine Zeit gab, wo die Republik sich komplett auf sich zurückgezogen hat und dann nicht mehr in der Lage war, andere auch noch wirklich zu beschützen. Und dann hast du eben diese einzelne Jedi da draußen, die versucht, den Leuten in Gebieten, die von den absurdesten Sith Lords der Geschichte meines Erachtens beherrscht werden, zu helfen. Und da sind Leute dabei, die sind einfach nur unglaublich kreativ, unglaublich innovativ auch gestaltet als Sith Lords. Einige von denen sind sogar auf den ersten Blick nicht mal zwangsläufig wirklich böse. Auf den zweiten Blick merkst du dann, oh, die sind eigentlich fast noch schlimmer als die du wirklich für böse gehalten hast. Und also ich finde, es ist ein Riesenspaß, da in diese Welt reinzugehen. Bei den Comics bin ich nicht 100% sicher, ob ich das auch so sehe, ich fand, die Comics waren jetzt nicht ganz so gut wie der Roman. Aber ich finde, zusammen sind sie auch schon aufgrund der Tatsache, dass ein Autor da sowohl in Roman als auch Comics beisteuern konnte, eine unglaublich faszinierende Mini-Welt für Star Wars. Und deshalb kann ich die eigentlich auch empfehlen. Und hat das jetzt Kanon-Probleme? Ja, vermutlich, aber im Moment wissen wir es noch nicht, würde ich fast sagen.
Das hatten wir jetzt auch nicht im Interview drin, aber wir hatten so unter uns nochmal überlegt, also ja, was wäre ein gutes nächstes Projekt für ihn jetzt, wo er aktuell mehr Star Trek macht, aber er immer noch Connection zu Star Wars hat. Und ich glaube, ihn nochmal auf eine neue Epoche loszulassen, wäre das, was wir uns beide am meisten wünschen würden. Ja. Aber ist halt die Frage, ob es gerade in die größere Planung hineinpasst.
Alternativ könnte ich mir vorstellen, dass es total witzig sein könnte, wenn er nochmal Ray Sloan macht, jetzt in der Zeit, wo wir sie nicht mehr gesehen haben, weil ich glaube, kennen wir ihren Tod, wissen wir, wie sie endet? Nee, ne, oder? Ich habe Phasma nicht gelesen und ich bin ehrlich gesagt in der Ära nicht so recht drin, was da mit ihr Sache ist.
Ich meine, sie ist nicht mal drin in Phasma. Ich glaube, Phasma ist eher Hux bezogen. Da stirbt der alte Hux.
Okay.
Der Vater von.
Weil generell würde ich sagen, Ray Sloan könnte noch mal eine interessante Figur sein, jetzt auf dem Weg hin zu Palpatines unbekannte Regionen-Projekte und so weiter und vielleicht Aufstieg Snoke und so weiter. Und da könnte man aus ihrer Sicht einen sehr schönen Roman noch mal bauen. Und ich denke, das könnte unterhaltsam sein.
Ja, wir hoffen, euch hat's wenigstens ein Bruchteil so viel Spaß gemacht wie uns. Und ein paar einfach Informationsbrocken zum Ende nochmal. Also Kenobi in der Essential Legends Collection erscheint am 5. April. Aber das Buch ist natürlich auch jetzt schon in der normalen Version weiterhin erhältlich. Auch als sehr gutes Hörbuch. Also hat ein bisschen die Plus-Minus-Sachen, auf die man bei Star Wars Hörbüchern generell gefasst sein muss. Also Sounddesign, manche mögen es nicht. Aber wenn man damit einverstanden ist, dann ist es sehr gut produziert. Kenobis Re-Release-Geschwister sind Darth Plagueis, Darth Bane und das Buch Wedge's Gamble. Das ist Teil 2 der X-Wing-Serie, meine ich.
Und noch ein guter Teil. Es ist auf Deutsch meines Erachtens, auf Deutsch ist es durch die Mission der Rebellen und ist ein recht netter Undercover-Einsatz von irgendwelchen Rebellen auf Coruscant. Und Coruscant wird noch beherrscht vom Imperium. Und es ist cool und es enthält diese netten Szenen, wo die ins Imperiale Museum gehen. Und wo sie dort eben diverse Dinge sehen darüber, wie Palpatine auf Endor sich heldenhaft geopfert hat zur Verteidigung der Galaxis gegen die bösen Rebellen und so.
Sie finden einen fast vollständigen Teppich.
Ja, genau.
Yep. Und, Darth Bane, sollte ich sagen, ist der 3. Teil. Aber die anderen beiden Bände müssten auch schon in der Essential Legends Collection raus sein. Und Darth Plagueis ist natürlich das Lucino-Buch, das wir prinzipiell als interessant empfehlen würden, Ist halt immer bei Lucino die Frage, ist es jetzt die mitreißendste Geschichte, aber es ist auf jeden Fall ein Buch, was es so nicht nochmal gibt und vielleicht auch nicht wieder geben wird.
Also Tarkin war ja quasi so ein gewissermaßen nochmal ein Versuch, das Ganze im Kanon nochmal zu machen, vielleicht so ein bisschen. Und ich würde sagen, bei Tarkin ist es jetzt nicht so ganz geglückt und bei Darth Plagueis ist es mehr geglückt und ich würde nach wie vor sagen, bei Cloak of Deception ist es am besten geglückt.
Wer sich für mehr Diskussionen zu eben den genannten älteren, aber dennoch relevanten oder zumindest sehr kultigen Büchern interessiert, Christoph und ich sprechen in den normalen Buchclub-Folgen gerade über die New Jedi Order. Da ist Teil 5 unserer Diskussion, also zum 5. Buch, entweder jetzt gerade raus oder erscheint in Kürze, eins von beiden, wo wir über das 2. der Lucino-Bücher sprechen. Und angeblich, und wir nehmen das hier einen Tick in der Vergangenheit auf, das heißt, da kann sich mit der aktuellen Welt- und Pandemielage schon wieder ein bisschen was geändert haben, aber wie es scheint, ist der Hauptpodcast wohl am 12. April 2022 zu Gast im Columbia Theater in Berlin. Ich selbst bin offenbar dabei. Würde es aber schon hauptsächlich bewerben als Ben Jörg live. Ben, ich habe mir das kurz notiert, Ben hat versprochen, Beethovens 4. aufzuführen, auf dem titelgebenden Instrument des 3DS-Remakes von Ocarina of Time. Also darauf kann man sich freuen. Und Jörg hat vorgeschlagen, dass er in die Gräber der alten Zeit hinabsteigen und die gefräßigen Götter unserer Vorfahren für eine Symphonie des Schreckens versammeln will, plus minus ein paar Goodies aus seiner Star Wars-Sammlung. Also seid dabei. Und schaut vorher eventuell nochmal auf weltenfunk.de oder irgendwie unserem Twitter-Account, ob sich da an den Daten nichts geändert hat. Also ja, leicht surreale Idee. Also ich kann mir noch nicht wirklich vorstellen, dass das passiert. Aber ich hätte auch nicht gedacht, dass wir je John Jackson Miller interviewen. Also wer weiß. Vielleicht ist das hier eine Zeit für unerwartete Dinge.
Genau. Die Dunkelheit ist bekanntlich furchtbar und so weiter und so fort. Aber
sie ist großzügig.
Und sie ist großzügig. Und außerdem, manche träumen auch in der finstersten Nacht von der Dämmerung. Also insofern es kann eine Sonne aufgehen, Tim. Es ist wunderbar. Es ist einfach toll.
Wir möchten außerdem, wie in jeder Folge, den Episode 3 Roman empfehlen von Matthew Stover. Ja, hat großen Spaß gemacht. Nochmal vielen Dank an dich, dass du
dass ich dich getriezt habe, dass du ihn anschreibst, ja.
Dass du jede meiner Mails an ihn erst nochmal, habe ich dir zum Korrekturlesen gegeben, weil ich gedacht habe, hoffentlich verbocke ich das hier nicht. Und selbst dann habe ich noch einmal Salz um mich rumgestreut und einmal auf den Boden gespuckt und einmal in die Hände geklatscht oder so. Und dann habe ich auf Senden gedrückt und dachte, okay, here goes nothing. Und
dann wurdest du weder gefressen noch irgendwie angemacht von ihm irgendwie negativer Art, sondern du hast einfach einen netten Menschen gefunden.
Ja, einfach, genau. Ganz normale Mail kam so, yeah, we can do a discussion. Was geht? Ja, also krass. In diesem Sinne, macht's erstmal gut und wir sprechen und hören uns hoffentlich alle bald wieder.
Genau. Macht's gut. Bis bald.